Chris and Shanann Watts had been together for years. They were the kind of couple that seemed perfect to everyone around them. Good-looking, with 2 young daughters, a beautiful house in Frederick, Colorado, and a life that seemed filled with love and success. To the outside world, their family was everything one could dream of. Shanann was an ambitious woman who worked as a sales representative for a health and wellness company, and she spent a lot of time traveling. Despite her busy schedule, she made sure to stay connected with her family, often posting happy moments on social media to showcase their picture-perfect life. Her posts were filled with joy, from birthday celebrations to family vacations, and it seemed that everything was exactly as it should be. Chris, on the other hand, worked in the oil and gas industry. He was quieter, not as outgoing as Shanann, but no less dedicated. He provided for his family, working long hours at his job as an operator. His co-workers often described him as reserved, but when he was with his family, he was attentive and affectionate. On social media, Chris often appeared as the supportive husband and loving father, always smiling alongside his daughters, Bella and Celeste. To anyone who followed their lives online, they were a family that appeared inseparable. But behind closed doors, things were not as perfect as they seemed. Despite the smiles and the happy photos, the relationship between Chris and Shanann had started to show signs of strain. There were arguments that grew more frequent, and Chris had become distant. Shanann noticed that Chris wasn't as affectionate as he used to be. He wasn't as interested in spending time with her or talking about their future. The emotional connection they once had seemed to be fading, and though Shanann tried to ignore it, she began to feel the changes. Their once strong bond was weakening, and even though they tried to work through it, the emotional distance continued to grow. Chris started spending more time at work, making excuses to avoid family activities. He would tell Shanann he was too tired or that he had to work extra hours, and Shanann, who worked hard herself, tried to understand, but the tension between them only worsened. Shanann had no idea that Chris's distance wasn't just a result of stress or exhaustion. It was something much deeper. Chris was hiding a secret, one that would change everything for their family. As he grew more detached from Shanann, he found someone who seemed to give him what he felt was missing from his marriage. He started an affair that would ultimately lead to a horrific and unimaginable outcome. In the months leading up to the tragic event, Chris and Shanann's relationship had become a battleground of emotions. Shanann would confront him about his coldness, but Chris always denied that anything was wrong. He assured her that everything was fine, that the distance was just a phase. But deep down, he was already emotionally checked out, and the affair he was having was his way of escaping from the responsibilities he no longer wanted to face. As the weeks passed, Chris's relationship with Shanann continued to deteriorate. The tension between them was palpable, yet Shanann held on, hoping that things would improve. She didn't know about the secret that Chris was hiding, a secret that would soon explode and bring their world crashing down. In early 2018, Chris met Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker who would soon become the center of his emotional and physical world. Nicole was attractive, younger than Shanann, and seemed to offer Chris a kind of excitement and validation that his marriage no longer provided. At first, their interactions were casual. They spoke here and there at work, but gradually they began texting each other, sharing personal details, and enjoying each other's company outside of the office. Chris began to confide in Nicole about his struggles with Shanann and his unhappiness at home. For Chris, Nicole represented an escape. She didn't have the same expectations of him that Shanann did. She didn't need him to be a father, or a husband, or a provider. Nicole was free of the demands that came with marriage and family. She was carefree and fun, and Chris quickly became captivated by her. Their relationship grew more intense as they spent more time together, talking about their future and making plans. At first, Nicole was unaware that Chris was married. When she found out, it didn't stop her. Chris told her that his marriage was already over, that he was unhappy and just staying in the relationship for the sake of his children. He assured her that he intended to leave Shanann and build a life with her. For Nicole, it was a dream come true. She believed him. She wanted to believe that Chris would eventually leave his wife and be with her. She could sense that he was emotionally distant from Shanann, and she convinced herself that Chris was in love with her, not Shanann. As their affair grew, Chris's behavior at home changed. He became more secretive, less interested in spending time with Shanann, and more focused on his relationship with Nicole. He would go out of his way to avoid conversations with Shanann about their marriage, and when Shanann asked about his emotional distance, Chris would simply tell her that he was tired or stressed. But Shanann felt it. She knew something was wrong, even if she didn't know what. It was becoming increasingly clear that Chris wasn't the man he once was. He had pulled away emotionally, and she didn't understand why. Shanann tried to address the issues in their marriage. She took time to plan special evenings for them, trying to reconnect and rekindle the spark they once had. But every effort was met with resistance. Chris's lack of enthusiasm was hard to ignore. He was physically there, but emotionally, he had checked out. He spent more time working or going on long drives, excusing himself from family gatherings and moments that used to bring him joy. Meanwhile, Nickel was becoming more and more central to his thoughts. Their relationship had progressed to the point where Chris began spending time with her outside of work. He would text her during the day, call her at night, and they even made plans for a future together. Chris began telling Nickel that his marriage was essentially over, but he couldn't leave Shanann just yet. He was stuck. The family he had built was standing in the way of his happiness, or so he convinced himself. Nickel, too, was falling for Chris. She loved the attention he gave her, the compliments, and the way he made her feel special. But as the affair continued, she began to ask more questions. Was he really unhappy in his marriage? Was he really going to leave Shanann for her? Despite her growing doubts, Nickel chose to believe in Chris's promises. She ignored the warnings, the little voice in her head that told her something wasn't right. She wanted a future with him, and she was determined to see it through. Chris, meanwhile, had begun to spiral deeper into the affair, rationalizing his actions as necessary for his happiness. He told himself that the situation at home was untenable, that he had no choice but to leave Shanann. He justified his lies, his cheating, and his emotional abandonment of his family, all in the name of what he felt was his own happiness. The truth was, Chris wasn't just emotionally disconnected from Shanann. He was actively planning to end his marriage, but not in a way anyone would have imagined. He wasn't planning on talking things through or seeking counseling. He wasn't planning on divorcing her in the traditional sense. His plan to leave his family was far darker and more tragic than anyone could have ever anticipated. By mid-August 2018, Chris had convinced himself that his marriage was beyond repair. The distance between him and Shanann had reached an all-time high, and his emotions had become so clouded by his affair with Nickel Kessinger that he could no longer see a way out. He wanted freedom, and in his mind, that freedom could only come by leaving Shanann and his daughters behind. He was no longer the man he once was, and he no longer had any intention of reconciling with Shanann. Chris had become so emotionally detached that he started treating his wife like an obstacle in his life. His feelings of resentment towards Shanann, combined with the promise of a new life with Nickel, pushed him to the brink. He was tired of the lies, the arguments, and the responsibilities of being a husband and a father. It was all too much for him, and in the chaos of his emotions, he believed that his family was holding him back from true happiness. On the night of August 13th, 2018, Chris's internal battle reached its tragic conclusion. Shanann had just returned home from a business trip to Arizona, and she was excited to see her husband and daughters. She had been away for several days, and her excitement to be back with her family was clear. She sent a video to her friends, joking around with the girls and showing off her baby bump. She was pregnant with their third child, a son they planned to name Nico. But when Shanann arrived home that night, the atmosphere in the house was anything but joyful. Chris greeted her with indifference, and his coldness was immediately noticeable. Shanann, though tired from her trip, was eager to reconnect with him. She attempted to talk to him about their relationship, to understand why he had become so distant. But instead of engaging, Chris grew more agitated, and the conversation quickly turned into a confrontation. Shanann wanted answers. She was tired of feeling like an outsider in her own marriage. Chris's anger had been brewing for months, and now it was unleashed. In an emotionally charged moment, he snapped. The argument escalated quickly, and in a fit of rage, Chris strangled Shanann to death. The woman he had once promised to love and cherish was now lifeless on the floor. His hands, the same hands that had once held her lovingly, had taken away her life. In the aftermath, Chris's mind raced. He couldn't believe what he had just done. But his thoughts were not filled with guilt or remorse. He was consumed with fear. fear of what would happen if anyone found out, fear of what the authorities would think when they realized Shanann was dead, and fear of the impact this would have on his affair with Nickel. Chris believed that if he could make it look like Shanann had killed the girls and then killed herself, he would be able to walk away without suspicion. As if the death of Shanann wasn't enough, Chris then turned his focus to the two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, who were asleep in their beds, unaware of the horror that had just unfolded in the house. The sisters were so young, so innocent, and yet they too were going to be caught in Chris's violent web of lies. Chris smothered each of them with a pillow, one after the other. The girls never had a chance to scream, to fight back, or to even understand what was happening. In an instant, Chris wiped out the lives of the two little girls he had once claimed to love. He didn't pause for a moment to consider the devastation he was leaving behind. His actions were cold, calculated, and chilling. After the murders, Chris had to figure out what to do with the bodies. He couldn't simply leave them where they were, and he couldn't risk them being found too soon. He placed Shanann's body into the back of his truck, along with the bodies of Bella and Celeste. He drove to the oil site where he worked, an isolated, remote location, and disposed of their bodies. It was there, in the desolate and harsh environment, that he left them to be hidden from the world, believing that his crimes would remain undetected. With the bodies out of sight, Chris drove back to the house and began the facade. He called his mistress, Nickel, and told her about the night's events. He claimed that Shanann had killed the girls and that he had been forced to kill her in self-defense. He wanted Nickel to believe that he was the victim of a terrible tragedy, the innocent man caught up in a nightmare. Meanwhile, the rest of the world had no idea what had happened. Shanann's friends and family grew worried when they couldn't reach her the next morning. They began calling Chris, but he acted as though everything was normal. When Shanann didn't show up for her ultrasound appointment, the alarm bells began ringing. Something was terribly wrong. The morning after the murders, Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson was the first to grow concerned. She had dropped Shanann off at home the night before, and since she hadn't heard from her, she began to worry. Shanann had a 15-week ultrasound scheduled for that morning, and when she didn't show up for the appointment, Nicole grew frantic. She attempted to reach her friend several times, but there was no answer. Nicole knew something wasn't right. She had seen Shanann's vibrant personality and her constant communication with family and friends. It was unlike her to just vanish without a word. After calling Chris, who seemed unusually calm, Nicole contacted the authorities to report Shanann and the girls as missing. Local law enforcement responded quickly to the case. The police began canvassing the area around Shanann and Chris's home, looking for any signs of a struggle or anything that might lead them to their whereabouts. They knew something was off. Chris's behavior was strange, and his initial statements didn't seem to match the gravity of the situation. As the hours passed, Chris continued to act as though he were a helpless husband, desperate for his family's safe return. He appeared on local news, pleading for information about their whereabouts, even though behind the scenes, he already knew where they were. His emotions seemed disconnected, almost rehearsed. It was as though he was playing a part, a grieving father and husband, desperate to find his family. But to the detectives, there was something about Chris that felt wrong. Detectives began to notice the inconsistencies in Chris's story. His timeline of events didn't add up, and his explanations for Shanann's disappearance kept changing. They found it strange that Chris had seemed so calm when talking about his wife and daughters being missing, especially considering how much they meant to him. His responses were short and emotionless, and the authorities began to wonder if he had something to hide. The investigation quickly moved forward, focusing on Chris. They interviewed neighbors and friends, trying to get a sense of the Watts family's daily routine. They also began to look into Chris's phone and online activity. It didn't take long for investigators to discover the affair. Chris had been communicating with Nickel Kessinger, a co-worker, for months. His behavior around the time of Shanann's disappearance appeared even more suspicious when they realized he had been having an affair with Nickel and had been lying to Shanann about it. The police soon discovered that Chris had been emotionally checked out of his marriage for months. They found messages between him and Nickel that revealed the depth of their relationship and how Chris had been lying to both women. As the investigation unfolded, it became clearer that Chris had a plan. He wanted to start a new life with Nickel, but there were obstacles standing in his way. His wife and daughters were standing in the way of his so-called freedom, and in a moment of selfishness and rage, Chris decided to eliminate those obstacles. Detectives soon turned their attention to the oil field where Chris worked. It was a remote location, and they believed it was the place where Chris had disposed of the bodies. They began searching the area, and it didn't take long before they discovered Shanann's body. It was hidden in the field, placed in a shallow grave. The authorities continued to search the area, and soon after, they found the bodies of Bella and Celeste, Chris's young daughters, whose lives had been taken without mercy. The shocking truth began to emerge. The man who had been pleading for his family's safe return was, in fact, their killer. The authorities arrested Chris Watts on suspicion of murder, and his carefully constructed facade as a grieving husband and father began to unravel. As the investigation into the disappearance of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste Watts moved forward, the authorities knew they were getting closer to the truth. Chris Watts, the seemingly distraught husband and father, had been arrested and was in custody. But despite the mounting evidence against him, he still maintained his innocence. Chris's initial statements to the police were full of contradictions, and detectives continued to push him for answers. The moment of truth came during a pivotal interrogation. At first, Chris stuck to his story, telling the police that his wife had killed their daughters and that he had been forced to act in self-defense. He claimed that Shanann had come home late that night, and after an argument, she killed the girls in a fit of rage. He said he had no choice but to kill her in order to protect himself. But as the detectives dug deeper, they didn't believe him. His story just didn't add up, and the evidence pointed in a different direction. The investigators were relentless, and over time, they pieced together a clearer picture of what had happened in the Watts home. They confronted Chris with details that had been uncovered: his affair with Nickel, the inconsistencies in his story, and the discovery of the bodies. They knew that Chris's account of events was a fabrication, and they were closing in on him. Finally, the pressure became too much for Chris to bear. In a moment of overwhelming guilt and fear, he cracked. He admitted to everything. In a heartbreaking confession, Chris told investigators the full, horrifying story. He described how, after Shanann returned home from her business trip that night, they had an argument. According to Chris, he was angry with Shanann for confronting him about his emotional distance, and their conversation escalated. But the argument was not the reason for what happened next. Chris had already made up his mind. In his confession, Chris explained that after the argument, Shanann went to their bedroom and he followed her. He said he strangled her, the woman he had once loved, with his bare hands. When asked why, he could not give a coherent reason. It was clear that the affair with Nickel had clouded his judgment, and in a moment of deep emotional disconnect, Chris felt that the only way out was through violence. But the horror didn't end there. After Shanann was dead, Chris turned his attention to his daughters. Bella and Celeste, who had been asleep in their beds, were now in danger as well. According to Chris, he smothered them with a pillow, one after the other. Their cries and struggles were never heard, and their young lives were taken so suddenly and mercilessly. In a matter of minutes, Chris had destroyed his entire family. The details of Chris's confession were chilling. He spoke of how he had disposed of the bodies at the oil field where he worked, driving his truck to the remote site and hiding Shannan's body in a shallow grave. He placed his daughters' bodies in oil tanks, a final, horrific act of cruelty. When he was done, he drove home, as if nothing had happened, and began his charade of grief. Chris's confession sent shockwaves through the investigation team, but even more so through Shannan's family, friends, and the entire community. The man they had trusted, the man who had appeared to be so devoted to his family, was a cold-blooded killer. The full extent of Chris's crime was now clear. He had murdered his wife and daughters, driven by selfish desires and emotional turmoil, and then tried to cover up his actions. The man who had appeared so normal, so caring, had hidden a dark, violent side that would leave the world in shock. The confession of Chris Watts was just the beginning of a long and painful process that would unfold in the weeks and months to come. As news of the horrific murders spread, the Watts family was thrust into the public eye. What had once seemed like an ordinary suburban family had become the focus of a national tragedy. People everywhere were left wondering, how could this happen? What would lead a man to destroy the lives of his wife and children so brutally? In the days following Chris's arrest, the media coverage exploded. Shanann's family, particularly her parents, Frank and Sandra Zuchek, were devastated. They had lost their daughter and two granddaughters, and they now faced the grim reality that the person responsible for their deaths was someone they had trusted. Shanann's friends, who had always admired her strength and resilience, were also reeling from the news. How could someone who had seemed so normal, so loving, commit such an unfathomable act? The police continued to work diligently to piece together the details of the case, while Chris's defense team prepared for his trial. But even before the trial could begin, Chris's confession had already sealed his fate. The prosecution had a wealth of evidence against him, including his own words, the discovery of the bodies, and the forensic evidence that linked him to the crime scene. It was clear that Chris Watts had committed the murders, and his trial would serve as a public reckoning for his horrific actions. In November 2018, Chris Watts was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, one for Shanann, one for Bella, and one for Celeste. The prosecution also sought additional charges related to the disposal of the bodies and the crimes committed during the commission of the murders. However, despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Chris initially seemed set on pleading not guilty. The legal proceedings dragged on, but Chris's defense team continued to prepare their case. Yet, in the midst of this legal process, a plea deal was offered. The prosecution was willing to accept a plea of guilty in exchange for Chris avoiding the death penalty. After weeks of negotiations, Chris accepted the deal. On November 6, 2018, he appeared in court for a sentencing hearing, where he formally pled guilty to all charges. In an emotional moment, Chris's parents were present in the courtroom, but they were unable to shield him from the devastating consequences of his actions. Shanann's family, especially her parents and brother, were also in the courtroom. They were determined to be there for their daughter and granddaughters, but they struggled to process the reality of the situation. The grief was overwhelming, and there were no words that could possibly explain the depth of their pain. Chris's guilty plea meant that he would face life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing was swift, and the judge declared that Chris Watts would spend the rest of his life behind bars for the brutal murders of his wife and children. It was a sentencing that brought some semblance of justice for Shanann and her daughters, though it could never replace the lives that had been lost. While Chris was sentenced to prison, the Watts family continued to grieve. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra, spoke out publicly, calling for justice for their daughter and granddaughters. They had never imagined that their daughter's life would end so violently, and they struggled to come to terms with the betrayal that Chris had committed. In the years following the murders, Shanann's family worked to keep her memory alive. They became outspoken advocates for domestic violence awareness, using their painful experience to educate others about the dangers of emotional abuse and controlling behavior. Shanann's story served as a reminder of how toxic relationships could be hidden behind closed doors, and how important it was to recognize the signs before it was too late. For Chris, life behind bars was a stark contrast to the life he once had. The man who had once been a family man, living in a home with a wife and children, was now alone, serving a life sentence. He would never see his children grow up. He would never have the chance to build a future with Nicole Kessinger, who had believed in him so completely. His life was over in a sense, but it was also a punishment he would have to live with for the rest of his life. As for Nicole, she was left to pick up the pieces of her own life. She had believed Chris's lies, trusted him with her heart, and had even imagined a future with him. In the aftermath of the murders, Nicole faced intense public scrutiny. She had never been involved in the killings, but her relationship with Chris was now forever tainted by his actions. She would forever be associated with one of the most shocking crimes in modern history. The Watts family's tragedy had ripples far beyond the small town of Frederick, Colorado. It sparked conversations about domestic violence, the psychology of emotional manipulation, and the consequences of unchecked rage. People asked how a man could go from seemingly normal to a brutal killer, and what warning signs might have been missed along the way. The case became a symbol of how easily the facade of a happy family could hide the darkest of secrets. As the years passed, the story of Chris Watts, Shanann, and their daughters became an enduring cautionary tale. Shanann's family continued to honor her memory, and while the pain would never fully dissipate, they found solace in knowing that Shanann and her daughters had not been forgotten. The tragic murders of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste Watts would never be erased from the public consciousness, and the consequences of Chris Watts' actions would live on forever. We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you found this story insightful, please subscribe and leave us a like. We would really appreciate that.